With Reverend Dr. J.W. Morrison, theologist, Gosford, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. Thank you for joining me. Just in from a big day of bricklaying. We were down at North Narrabeen, the Mecca of surfing, and the North Shore of Sydney. And I want to speak to you about being discarded, and some of the motives behind what that can do. The relationship's going along fine, and a couple of things don't suit the person that you're with, so they go and into a discard. They give you a few warnings. You get a warning about this and a warning about that. You're possibly aware that something isn't quite right, but you're not sure exactly what it is, or maybe you're just ignorant. Some people are ignorant and lose their relationships out of just laziness and lack of thought and self-awareness and self-introspection. And you start to shift your beliefs from the relationship to a different idea of what you think the relationship should be. And it may not necessarily be legitimate, and the person that's complaining may not necessarily be fair either. So you have to come to this place which is called fighting fair. Now, fighting fair doesn't really fit in with being discarded or the no contact rule and all this other stuff. Fighting fair is something that should happen before all this stuff takes place. But let me read from Galatians 1 chapter 6, where Paul says, "I'm amazed how quickly you are deserting the one," that's the Father. Oh dear. Oh, we got a bit of a hiccup, viewers. Just bear with me. I'll get this back in order now. I'll have to switch to a picture. That's a fair enough picture, I think. That's actually North Narrabeen. I'll go to this one here. We'll just use that. Me winging. But Paul says to the church in Galatia, "I'm amazed how quickly you are deserting the Father who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel." People that listen to my messages understand that this is the common thread of Galatians, was to help the Jewish believers who had given millenniums to following the Mosaic law for righteousness with God, which failed. He was convincing them that it's all okay to leave that behind and follow Christ. God's plan now is by faith in Christ, and he had a lot of difficulty with this, a lot of opposition with this. Not all of the believers believed that the law was to be left behind, and this was a contention he was having in Rome and Galatia and other places as well. And can you imagine if all of your culture, your domestic culture, say it's drugs, and you meet somebody and they say, "Look, there's a better way for you than being on drugs." It's not going to be easy for that person just to turn away from their alcohol or their drugs or their medications. And if they get people around them that are into these things, then it's going to be evident that some people will trouble them and try and distort the way of a person being straight, as they did distort the gospel of Christ here in Galatia, and try and keep that person in their medication and drug condition. Now remember, anything that is offered by a doctor by prescription is legit. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about recreational abuse of medications, alcohol, and drugs. What a lot of people are dealing with now in their relationships are interferers, people who can turn people away from their relationship, be it with God or the person that they love, by troubling them and distorting the reality of their relationship then this is evident. This is happening all the time. It's not good news that they're bringing or listening to about their partner or their relationship. And some of it might be legitimate. Sometimes we bring trouble on ourselves and cause undue stress on our partner. But if your life is in order and you believe that you're self-examined enough and not ignorant enough to be able to at least be trying to do the right thing by somebody, and that's not happening in return, this is where these people, these imposters, can quickly and amazingly come in and help you to desert the faith that you have in your relationship by troubling you and distorting the truth of what's actually going on. Now, the trouble here in Galatia, just from a theological perspective, was, as I said before, and you need to understand this, Paul was trying to convince the Israeli believers who had been under the law for millenniums that it was now time to let that go, that it was finished with, abolished and done away with in the crucifixion of Christ, and that it is okay for you. Can you imagine the enormity of this job Paul had to do? It is okay. The Messiah has come. Jesus Christ of Nazareth is the Messiah. And if you believe in him, as the scriptures have said, your sins will be forgiven and you are right with God. But they couldn't let go of the Mosaic law. They couldn't come to terms with the fact that that was okay. And the ones that were unable to, and steadfast and stubborn about this not happening, were evidently troubling these people and trying to distort the truth of who Christ was. That's why Paul later in chapter 3 really cuts loose when he says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" And Paul says, but even if we are an angel from heaven, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, which was Christ crucified, let them be under a curse. Now, these people that are coming along and troubling people with their relationships, Paul's attitude was that they should let them be accursed. Let that karma come back on them. Because people that undo relationships cause a lot of damage to the minds and the hearts and the investments that people have made one to another in the union that they've agreed to have. And Paul says, as we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be under a curse. So it's a cursed person that interferes in people's relationships and tries to distort who that person is. Now, it's up to you to find out what the truth of the matter is. And I've had terrible trouble with this over the years. People they wouldn't have a clue who I am. The women that have been with me, they know who I am. They know exactly who I am. And they know what I'll tolerate and what I won't. And vice versa. But it's evident in any relationship that you're going to have, there will be somebody that will come along and try and distort the health of it, the reality of it, and trouble your partner with bad news, the bad news of the relationship, instead of the good news of the gospel, as in paralleling with this. Now, when it comes to the point of discard, sometimes a person will go into a discard to test what you will do. And they'll do this when the relationship seems to be going along relatively fine. I mean, there's no point discarding someone when the relationship's just about shot, because I think in most cases both parties will be happy just to go back into their corner and say, well, thanks for the time we had together, but there's better things for both of us to do. This usually happens when the relationship is developing or maybe even peaking, to try and work out what the value of the person that is being discarded has towards a relationship. and what power shifts will take place, if any, should the person decide that the relationship's worth having after they've been discarded. Now, a lot of people, when they get discarded, they just get discarded and go back into the shadows and you never hear from them again. Some people will try and reason, but most people haven't got the mental capacity or handle on their relationship these days to even bother with that. So when they get discarded, they just go, as I said, into their shadow, back into their cave, back to their default, back to zero, and possibly wherever they're going to go from there. Maybe they'll meet a friend through a friend, or the dating sites where all the predators are, this kind of thing. It's really none of your business what happens. But some people won't be discarded, and they will want to reason and find resolve with whatever the situation is. And sometimes this can bring power to the relationship. Other times it can bring a disempowerment to the person that's been discarded, who decides that it's worth trying to reason. Because most of the reasoning should have been done before the discard. If a discard's just being dropped on somebody for over the accumulation of the problem, then usually that's a sign that the person that has been discarded either has no value in resolving the problem or no value in the relationship. Because if you don't resolve something, that means the unresolved is more important than the fruit of resolve. And therefore the relationship just isn't going to hold because the person hasn't got their teeth into it far enough. So being discarded can have many different results and many different consequences. But when it comes to somebody that's trying to make a power play, to put a bit of fear into somebody, to make them rev up a little bit in the relationship, and that works, well, it gives that person now one of two things. One is the ability to manipulate and control, or the other one is, which is more of a Christian perspective, the ability now to put the problem to the side and to continue to build the relationship and nurture one another. People who get neglected, discarded because of their neglect, they're usually not going to change anyway, because they've been discarded for a characteristic or personality flaw which they don't think was worth changing to keep the relationship going. So those types of people, you're probably better off just leaving them go anyway. Even if they do come back, you're better off letting them go, because people that haven't got a conscience of how they're investing themselves, how you're investing themselves, the positives and the negatives of that, and the definite negatives if there's a breakup, the healing time, the upturn, the sadness, the sorrow, the trauma, then these people are dangerous and they are possibly narcissistic. And the narcissist will just go on to find somebody else in most cases, because they need supply. They need to have some kind of supply. These are people that will ask you if you're codependent and all this, but they're codependent themselves. They're codependent on drugs, they're codependent on medications, alcohol, and all the rest of it. So sometimes a discard can be a bluff to see how invested the other person is in the relationship. But if that goes belly up, well, they've really blown it and they've done the relationship. And you'll see them try and grovel back. But when you discard somebody, they're not usually going to want you back. It's a terrible thing to do to someone, even if it is for the right reasons. And it's very sad. But if somebody's discarded for out and out negligence towards a relationship, maybe they've been, as what's happening here in Galatia, Some people have troubled them and distorted what the actual truth about you is. And evidently that distortion has played out in their cognitive, they've gone into cognitive distortion, and that's really not going to help them to conclude on where they really stand. That's why interferers are the biggest menace to personal relationships. And that's why you have to have boundaries. See, a lot of the people that lose their relationships are people without boundaries. They let too many people interfere. They let too many people get involved. And the next thing you know, they have no relationship. So sometimes being discarded can be a power play, or it can be a cry for help. It's up to you to decide. Usually a discard can be a cry for help. But whatever the case might be, one thing is for sure: if the relationship is important to you, you have to be aware of these people that the devil will send along that will try and destroy it on you. And if you can be aware of that, then maybe deserting the person that you're with and listening to a different concept of the relationship that's possibly not real, usually isn't real. A lot of these people can't manage their own relationships, let alone interfering in somebody else's. Then you might be able to sit down and fight fair and resolve things and bring peace back to your individual situation. Relationships aren't something that should be trifled with or played with. They have a tremendous impact on your psychological and emotional and physical and spiritual health. These values are being lost as time moves into the future more quickly. The shadows and the darkness are coming over the true values of what make a relationship work. More people are turning to the soothing of alcohol, drugs, medications, and other recreational forms of substances and things that destroy them. And that can be coordinated with reckless sex and careless sex and sex that brings diseases and all this other stuff that's happening to people. And in particular, it can also bring psychological problems and mental and emotional damage. People don't realize how dangerous sex is when it's just used as a game. So you're up against a lot. You have to be wise. You have to be aware. You have to have your mind about you. But don't be one of these people where people turn around and that you're with and go, I'm so amazed that you were so quick to desert the relationship that we were building. Some people know that there's things that they need to change and they're not prepared to do that. Then they have to put their hand up and go, well, I brought that on myself. And I brought that on myself at the expense of both of us. That's a different story. But you be careful of people that are going to try and interfere and convince you that your relationship is not what you think it is. Because it's none of their business, and usually they are partial, and lonely people don't want to be lonely on their own. They like lonely people. They like to have an awareness that other people are lonely as well. Stay close to Christ, the good news of the gospel. Follow in his footsteps and love your neighbour as yourself. This is Reverend Dr. J.W. Morrison, theologist, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. You can subscribe if you feel that this has been of benefit to you. And for those that do need to talk, you can contact me on the information below. Thank you for joining me. And as always, you can share all my content. Doesn't matter. Bye for now.